How many times have you entrusted your life to someone without questioning their intentions? A doctor takes your pulse, prescribes medication, and you take it without hesitation. This trust is universal. It transcends borders, politics, and even war. But what happens when that trust turns into a weapon? What happens when a man who swore to heal people becomes the instrument of your death? In the fall of 1996, there was a man lying in a private clinic in Amman, Jordan. He was no ordinary patient. He was at the top of Israel's most wanted list. He was a man who had orchestrated bombings, kidnappings, and murders across the Middle East. His name was known to intelligence agencies from Tel Aviv to Washington. But to the doctor standing at his bedside, he was a man in need of care and treatment. At least that's how it appeared. There was one thing the man didn't know. The doctor had switched sides, not because of ideology or money, but because of pressure, manipulation, and a combination of psychological warfare that only an organization like Mossad could execute so delicately. The medication he would be given in the coming days would not cure him. It would kill him, slowly, silently, and without leaving any trace of those who orchestrated it. Khaled Mashal's file had been growing thicker for years. Born in the West Bank in 1956, Mashal rose through the ranks of Hamas to become one of its most influential political operators. Unlike the bomb makers and field commanders who drew attention with violence, Mashal operated in the shadows of diplomacy and financial networks. He established relationships with donors in the Gulf countries, coordinated with Iranian sponsors, and maintained communication channels between the Hamas leadership in Gaza and operators scattered across the Arab world. He was not a fighter, he was an architect. He had been under Israeli intelligence surveillance since the early 1990s, documenting his movements, connections, and influence within Hamas's political bureau. Attacks carried out by his organization, including bus bombings in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and suicide attacks in crowded markets, had claimed the lives of hundreds of Israelis. Mashal himself never pulled the trigger or planted a bomb. However, his work facilitated the work of those who did. He was the logistical backbone of an organization that Israel viewed as an existential threat. By 1996, he was living in Amman under the protection of the Jordanian government, which had a complex relationship with both Israeli and Palestinian groups. Jordan had signed a peace treaty with Israel 2 years earlier, but it was still hosting Palestinian figures who continued their activities against Israel. Mashal moved relatively freely in Amman, attending meetings, occasionally visiting Arab countries, and giving the impression that he felt safe. Israeli planners believed that this security was an illusion they could exploit. The decision to target Mashal was not an easy one. To eliminate him, an operation had to be carried out on foreign soil, in a capital city where Israeli intelligence was weak. Jordan's security cooperation with Israel did not extend to tolerance for operations carried out within its borders. Any action had to be executed with such precision that it would avoid detection and leave no trace of a connection to Israel. The operation planners in Tel Aviv knew that failure would not only result in loss of life, but could also destroy the fragile peace between Israel and Jordan. The method chosen for the operation reflected the constraints imposed by the environment. A bombing or armed attack in Amman could instantly trigger a diplomatic crisis. Any approach involving overt violence in a public space could lead to the agents being caught and Israel being exposed as the force behind it. What we needed was a subtle method that appeared natural, or at least of unknown origin. Poison offered that possibility. Applied correctly, it could incapacitate or kill the target while leaving forensic evidence pointing to natural causes or untraceable substances. The difficulty was access. Mashal did not frequently visit public places where agents could approach him anonymously. He traveled with security personnel, maintained an unpredictable and irregular schedule, and stayed in locations that limited opportunities for the close contact necessary to administer the poison. Surveillance teams sent by Mossad to Amman identified his habits, but found few opportunities they could exploit using traditional methods. What they needed was not a moment of weakness in his routine, but a relationship of trust that would provide access security guards could not prevent. The doctor, treating Mashal, had been identified through intelligence work mapping networks supporting Hamas figures in Jordan. The doctor was not a Hamas member. He was a medical doctor serving a community that included Palestinian refugees and political exiles. He was a doctor with a good reputation and strong references, and his relationship with Mashal was based on years of professional service. This doctor was exactly the person Israeli intelligence was looking for. The process of contacting the doctor did not begin with threats or offers of money. It began with documenting every second of his life, his family, financial situation, movements, communications. The intelligence gathered revealed exploitable weaknesses and pressure points that would make him open to cooperation he would otherwise refuse. Mossad agents knew that to draw someone to their side, they needed to understand what he feared and what he valued. The doctor's file showed both. The first contact was carefully planned to appear coincidental, a conversation conducted by someone who seemed to share the same background or interests as the doctor, in a place where the doctor felt comfortable. The relationship developed over weeks, with the agent establishing a connection through discussions unrelated to intelligence or operations. Once trust was established, the conversation about who the agent really represented and what he knew about the doctor's life emerged at a calculated moment to maximize psychological impact. The offer was presented not as a choice between right and wrong, but as a choice between manageable outcomes and disastrous ones. The doctor was not asked to kill anyone directly. He was only asked to administer drugs that would appear identical to the treatments he routinely prescribed. This substance would cause symptoms requiring hospitalization, but would not result in immediate death. The target's death, if it occurred, would happen under circumstances that would not later incriminate the doctor or expose the deception. The framework was deliberately constructed. The required action was small, technical, almost clinical. The moral burden was distributed across a series of decisions where the doctor's own role could be minimized in his own mind. The pressure applied to secure compliance combined psychological manipulation with real threats. Mossad's knowledge about the doctor's life was laid bare. The safety of his family, his professional standing, his financial security, all were offered, contingent on his cooperation. The alternative to compliance was not explicitly detailed, but the consequences were very clear. He could refuse, but his refusal would bring consequences he might not be willing to bear. The intelligence services approaching him would not simply disappear. They would remain, watch, wait, and act according to the information they possessed. The doctor's acceptance of cooperation was not recorded as a moment of conversion or commitment. His gradually diminishing resistance was documented as a series of small concessions that accumulated until refusing became more difficult than complying. The agents managing him knew that agents who turned under pressure rarely showed enthusiasm. What mattered was not faith in the mission, but willingness to carry out the necessary actions. Motivation could be sustained through constant pressure and periodic reminders of why he had agreed. The substance that would be used in the operation was not a conventional poison. Israeli intelligence had access to chemical and biological agents, developed through research programs whose specifics remained classified. The compound selected for the Mashal operation was designed to produce symptoms that would mimic natural illness while being difficult to detect through standard medical testing. The effects are not seen immediately. The target would experience a gradual deterioration that could be linked to various medical conditions. By the time the cause was identified, if it ever was, the origin of the exposure would be impossible to trace. The delivery mechanism required that the substance be administered in a form the target would accept without suspicion. An injection during a routine medical appointment provided the most controlled method. The doctor would have applied treatment in a manner consistent with the care he had previously provided to his patient, simply following the required procedures, examining the patient, and carrying out the necessary intervention. The substance would be concealed in medication that the target expected to receive. Nothing in the interaction would suggest anything unusual. The trust that defined the doctor-patient relationship would be the weapon that enabled the operation. The operational timeline was established based on Mashal's schedule and the windows of opportunity that surveillance had identified. The next medical appointment that Mashal had scheduled with the doctor would serve as the moment for action. The timing allowed for preparation that ensured all elements were in position. The substance was delivered to the doctor through a method that avoided direct contact between Mossad operatives and the physician during the critical period. The risk of compromise was minimized by limiting the number of people who knew the operation's details and by using communication methods that were difficult to intercept or track. The morning of the appointment arrived without indication that anything unusual would occur. Mashal drove to the clinic with his security detail, a routine he had followed dozens of times before. He went inside for the examination, while the guards remained outside. The waiting room held other patients whose presence suggested normal operations. The receptionist who greeted him was the same person who had checked him in on previous visits. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. The environment itself provided reassurance that reinforced the trust that made him vulnerable. The examination began with standard procedures: blood pressure, pulse, questions about symptoms or concerns. The doctor's manner was professional and calm, his behavior indistinguishable from countless previous interactions. The conversation covered routine medical matters discussed during a medical examination. There was no tension, no indication that this visit would differ from any other. The doctor prepared the injection that would deliver the poison, his hands steady, his expression neutral. Years of medical training had taught him to perform procedures with precision, regardless of his internal state. That training now served purposes its teachers had never intended. The injection was administered as part of a treatment protocol that Mashal had previously received. The sting of the needle was momentary, and the discomfort was minimal. The procedure was completed within seconds. The doctor destroyed the syringe so that it could not be examined later. He completed the remainder of the examination, provided instructions for follow-up care, and saw his patient out. The entire appointment had lasted only about 30 minutes. To anyone observing, it was completely normal. However, the poison injected into Mashal's bloodstream had begun to do its work, slowly. The initial effects were subtle enough that Mashal attributed them to minor illness or fatigue. A headache, slight nausea, nothing that seemed alarming. He returned home and continued his activities, attending meetings and maintaining his schedule. Over the following hours, the symptoms intensified. The headache became severe, the nausea persistent. His bodyguards noticed his deteriorating condition and became concerned. By evening, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. He was transported to a hospital where physicians began working to diagnose what was causing his rapid decline. The medical team at the hospital was confronted with symptoms that did not match any diagnosis. Mashal's vital signs were becoming unstable in a manner suggestive of systemic poisoning. However, the initial tests revealed no findings. Toxicology screenings returned negative for common poisons. The doctors began consulting with specialists to determine which substance could be responsible for the observed effects. Time was critical. Mashal's condition was steadily worsening, and without knowing what they were treating, it was not possible to administer the specific interventions that might save him. The Jordanian intelligence services were notified almost immediately. The sudden illness of a high-profile Hamas figure, one whose presence in Jordan was politically sensitive, raised questions that went beyond medical diagnosis. Was this a natural illness, or had someone attempted to kill him? If it was an attack, who was responsible, and how had it been carried out? The security apparatus began investigating while doctors continued trying to stabilize their patient. The inquiry would soon produce answers, that would transform a medical crisis into a diplomatic catastrophe. The breakthrough in understanding what had happened came through forensic analysis and intelligence work that occurred in parallel. Jordanian security services had begun reviewing Mashal's recent activities, looking for any contact that might have enabled an attack. The visit to his doctor became a point of interest. Why had he fallen ill so soon after that appointment? The timing suggested a connection that needed investigation. At the same time, Israeli intelligence's surveillance of the operation revealed that something had gone wrong. Mashal had not died quietly as planned. He was hospitalized, and the Jordanians were investigating. The doctor who had administered the poison found himself in an impossible position. He had been told that the substance would work slowly and leave no obvious trail. Instead, his patient was dying rapidly, and investigators were asking questions. The pressure that had compelled his cooperation now became terror that he would be exposed. His communications with his Mossad handlers became desperate. He needed protection, extraction, something that would shield him from consequences that now seemed inevitable. The handlers tried to provide reassurance while recognizing that the operation had entered a phase whose outcome they could no longer control. The Jordanian investigators' work led them to evidence that pointed toward Israeli involvement. The nature of the poisoning, the timing of the attack, and intelligence they had gathered from other sources all suggested that Mossad had conducted an operation in Amman. The realization triggered a crisis that extended far beyond the medical emergency. Jordan and Israel had signed a peace treaty just 2 years earlier. That agreement was fragile, opposed by significant portions of Jordan's population, and dependent on trust between the two governments. An Israeli assassination attempt on Jordanian soil represented a violation that could destroy that trust and potentially unravel the peace that both countries' leaders had worked to establish. King Hussein of Jordan was faced with decisions that would have consequences affecting his country's security and his political power. He could not ignore an Israeli operation carried out on Jordanian territory. The domestic pressure to respond would be immense, and failing to do so would be interpreted as weakness or cooperation. At the same time, he was aware that severing relations with Israel would impose costs that Jordan could not easily bear. The pragmatic calculation that had led him to sign the peace treaty still applied. However, pragmatism required respect, and what had occurred in Amman represented a disrespect that demanded accountability. The king's response was swift and unambiguous. He contacted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directly, informing him that Jordan knew Israel was responsible for the poisoning attempt and demanding immediate provision of the antidote that would save Mashal's life. The message was clear. Provide the antidote, or the peace between Jordan and Israel would be over. The ultimatum left Netanyahu with no room for negotiation. The choice was between saving a Hamas operative whom Israel had sought to kill or destroying a peace treaty that served Israel's strategic interests. The internal debate within the Israeli government was brief. The operation had failed, not in its execution but in its aftermath. The poison had worked too quickly. The victim had not died quietly, and the Jordanians had discovered Israeli responsibility. The exposure meant that the political costs would be paid, regardless of whether Mashal survived. Refusing to provide the antidote would add the destruction of peace with Jordan to the operation's consequences, without achieving the strategic benefit that Mashal's death would have provided. The calculation was brutal but clear. The antidote was delivered to Jordanian authorities within hours of the king's demand. The substance that could neutralize the poison was provided, along with instructions for its administration. The physicians treating Mashal received the information they had desperately needed. The intervention came just in time. Had the antidote been delayed even a day longer, Mashal would likely have died regardless of treatment. The margin by which his life was saved measured in hours rather than days. The medical team stabilized him, and over the following weeks, he recovered. The man whom Mossad had tried to kill survived. his life preserved by the very government that had enabled the attack through its decision to comply with Jordan's ultimatum. The diplomatic fallout from the operation extended beyond the immediate crisis. King Hussein demanded that Israel release Hamas's founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, from prison as part of the price for maintaining relations. The elderly cleric, imprisoned since 1989, had been serving a life sentence for his role in founding and directing Hamas. His release was something Israel had previously refused to consider, but the leverage that Jordan now possessed, combined with the damage the assassination attempt had caused, forced Israel's hand. Sheikh Yassin was released and returned to Gaza, where he would resume leadership of Hamas until his own death in an Israeli airstrike 8 years later. The Mossad operatives involved in the operation faced consequences that reflected the magnitude of the failure. Mossad director Danny Yadim resigned as a result of this debacle. The operational planning that led to the attempt was reviewed and found to be seriously inadequate. The decision to carry out such a sensitive operation in Jordan, where Israel could not operate freely and where failure would entail devastating political costs, was deemed entirely flawed. The lessons drawn from this failure would guide future operations. However, those lessons were paid for with strategic damage and personal careers. The doctor who had administered the poison disappeared from public view. Whether he was extracted by Israeli intelligence, fled on his own, or suffered consequences at the hands of those who discovered his role remained unclear. The ambiguity surrounding his fate reflected the classified nature of such operations and the difficulty of verifying what happened to individuals caught between competing intelligence services. His story became one among many tales of agents compromised, used, and abandoned by the systems that recruited them. Khaled Mashal's survival transformed him from a significant Hamas figure into a symbol of resistance. The fact that he had been targeted by Israeli intelligence and had survived elevated his status within the organization and among supporters across the Arab world. He would go on to serve as head of Hamas's political bureau, operating from exile in Damascus and later Qatar, directing the organization's strategy for years. The assassination attempt that was meant to remove him instead prolonged his influence and enhanced his credibility. The relationship between Israel and Jordan required years to fully recover from the damage the operation had caused. King Hussein's anger at what he considered a betrayal of trust had been genuine and profound. The peace treaty survived, but the warmth that had characterized early relations between the two countries cooled. The intelligence cooperation that had been developing was scaled back. The realization that Israel would conduct operations on Jordanian soil without consultation created lasting suspicion that affected interactions at multiple levels. The operational methodology that the assassination attempt had employed became a cautionary tale within intelligence communities worldwide. The use of poison, delivered through a trusted relationship, had advantages in theory. In practice, the approach had exposed vulnerabilities that outweighed its benefits. The difficulty of controlling outcomes when chemical agents were involved, the risk of discovery when operations occurred in environments where investigators had resources to pursue inquiries, and the diplomatic costs of failure when operations were conducted on Allied territory, all featured in analyses that sought to extract lessons from what had occurred in Amman. The families of victims killed in Hamas, attacks that Mashal had helped coordinate, faced the bitter reality that the man whose death might have provided some measure of justice had survived. The classified nature of intelligence operations meant they would never know the full story of what had been attempted and why it had failed. Their grief continued without the closure that successful action might have provided. The passage of time dulling but never eliminating the loss they had suffered. The Hamas organization absorbed the lessons from the assassination attempt and modified its security protocols accordingly. The realization that Israeli intelligence could turn medical professionals into instruments of attack led to increased scrutiny of those who provided care to the organization's leadership. The trust that had enabled the operation became more difficult to exploit in subsequent efforts. The adaptation was not perfect, but it represented a shift in awareness that made certain approaches less viable than they had been before. The strategic assessment of the operation's impact produced different conclusions depending on perspective. Israeli analysts accepted it as a failure while debating whether the exposure might have yielded benefits that could offset the costs. Significant damage had occurred to relations with Jordan. However, the message sent to Hamas leadership that Israel possessed the will to target them anywhere was considered potentially deterrent, even if difficult to measure. The operation had failed to eliminate its target, but it had demonstrated capabilities that influenced how adversaries calculated their own security. Palestinian analysts focused on what the operation revealed about the vulnerability of their leadership and the lengths to which Israel would go to reach them. The fact that a doctor had been turned showed that no relationship could be taken for granted. The trust itself had become a weapon that could be used against them. The psychological impact of that realization extended beyond the specific individuals involved to affect how resistance organizations thought about security at every level. The poison that had been used in the operation remained a subject of speculation in intelligence circles. The substance's characteristics, its effects, and the antidote's nature were never publicly disclosed. The secrecy surrounding such tools served operational purposes that extended beyond any single mission. The ambiguity about what capabilities existed and what effects they might produce created uncertainty that affected planning by those who might become targets. The known unknowns were sometimes more valuable than certainties. The passage of time has not resolved the moral questions that the operation raised. Was the attempt to kill Mashal justified by the attacks his work had enabled? Did the method employed, turning a physician into an assassin, violate ethical boundaries that should constrain intelligence operations even in conflict? Can the doctor who administered the poison be considered a perpetrator or a victim? And does that distinction matter when assessing what occurred? The answers depend on premises that different observers do not share. The medical profession's relationship with intelligence services carries complications that the Mashal case illustrated dramatically. The trust that enables healthcare depends on assumptions about physicians' motivations and loyalties. When that trust is exploited for intelligence purposes, the damage extends beyond individual cases to affect how people in conflict zones view medical care itself. The reluctance to seek treatment, the suspicion of providers, the degradation of health outcomes, all represent costs that operations like the one in Amman impose on populations that intelligence calculations typically do not measure. The evolution of Mossad's operational methods in the years following the Amman disaster reflected organizational learning that incorporated the lessons from failure. The techniques that had proven problematic were modified or abandoned in favor of approaches whose risks could be better managed. The use of poison continued in Israeli operations, but the circumstances under which such methods would be employed were more carefully evaluated. The diplomatic consequences of failure became part of the calculus that shaped operational decisions at the planning stage, rather than something considered only after things went wrong. King Hussein's death in 1999, 3 years after the Mashal affair, removed from the scene the leader whose personal relationship with Israeli counterparts had shaped Jordan's response to the assassination attempt. His son, Abdullah II, inherited the peace treaty and the complicated legacy of managing relations with Israel while maintaining credibility with his own population and the broader Arab world. The Mashal incident remained part of that legacy, a reminder of the tensions that underlaid cooperation between parties whose fundamental interests only partially aligned. Khaled Mashal's departure from Hamas leadership in 2017 closed a period in the organization's past that included many formative events, among them the assassination attempt. His survival in 1997 did not prevent Israeli operations from targeting other Hamas members. As the organization navigated the complexities of resistance, governance, and regional politics, Mashal's influence sometimes increased and at other times declined. The attempt on his life did not define his career, but it shaped it in both obvious and subtle ways. The knowledge that Israel had attempted to eliminate him led to different and shifting decisions over the following 2 decades regarding security, location, and exposure. The doctor whose cooperation had enabled the operation never publicly told his story. Whether he lived in exile under Israeli protection, returned quietly to Jordan after some accommodation was reached, or met an end that official records did not document, remains unknown. His silence, whether imposed or voluntary, left gaps in the historical record that speculation could not fill. The human story of how he was recruited, what he thought while administering the poison, and how he understood his own role, would provide insights into the mechanics of intelligence operations that classified files protect even decades after events occur. The antidote that saved Mashal's life represented capabilities that few nations possessed. The ability to develop poisons effective enough to kill, but subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, combined with antidotes capable of reversing those poison's effects, required technical expertise and resources that only sophisticated intelligence services could marshal. The fact that Israel provided the antidote under pressure revealed capabilities that operational security would normally have protected. The exposure was forced by circumstances, but the revelation affected future operations by informing adversaries about what was possible. The political context within which the assassination attempt occurred reflected tensions that extended beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to encompass regional dynamics that shaped what was possible and what was forbidden. Jordan's peace with Israel had been controversial domestically from the moment it was signed. The king had pursued the treaty because he believed it served Jordan's interests, but significant portions of his population opposed normalization with Israel. The assassination attempt gave ammunition to those who argued that Israel could not be trusted and that peace was a trap rather than a path forward. Hamas's evolution in the years following the Mashal affair included adaptations that responded to the lessons the organization drew from the attempt. The emphasis on security, the compartmentalization of information, the suspicion of outsiders, all intensified in ways that made the organization more difficult to penetrate, but also more isolated. The trade-offs between security and effectiveness played out across multiple operations and strategic decisions. The organization that emerged from this process differed in important ways from what it had been before. The changes shaped partly by the recognition that Israel would use any vulnerability it could find. The question of what might have happened had the operation succeeded remains a subject of speculation. Would Mashal's death have significantly degraded Hamas's capabilities, or would the organization have adapted and continued with new leadership? Would the diplomatic crisis with Jordan have been avoided if the assassination had not been discovered, or would other factors have eventually exposed Israeli responsibility? The counterfactual scenarios cannot be tested, but they illuminate assumptions about cause and effect that shaped the decision to pursue the operation in the first place. The legacy of the attempted assassination extends across multiple domains that intersect in complex ways. The tactical failure became a strategic lesson. The personal tragedy of those affected became data points in intelligence files. The moral questions raised became subjects of classroom discussions and ethics courses. The diplomatic crisis became a chapter in books about Middle East politics. Each perspective captures part of what occurred while leaving other dimensions unexamined. The full picture remains fragmented, understood differently by those who experienced it from different positions. The surveillance footage, medical records, and communications, intercepts that documented various aspects of the operation, remain classified in archives whose access is restricted. The historical record available to researchers lacks the detail that would enable definitive assessment of key questions. The ambiguity serves operational purposes. that persist long after specific events conclude. Intelligence services protect methods and capabilities even when outcomes are known. The how matters as much as the what in maintaining effectiveness for future operations. The trust between doctor and patient that the operation exploited represents a universal vulnerability that extends beyond this specific case. The relationship depends on assumptions that enable care but create openings for abuse. When intelligence services identify and exploit those openings, they demonstrate capabilities that affect how people in conflict zones assess risks in every aspect of their lives. The man who avoided public markets for fear of bombs might feel safe in a doctor's office. The operation in Amman showed that nowhere was truly safe when adversaries possessed the will and capability to reach targets, regardless of context. The years that followed saw new targets, new operations, and new methods. The assassination attempt on Mashal became one incident among hundreds within ongoing campaigns that showed no sign of ending. Israeli intelligence continued to pursue Hamas leaders. Hamas in turn continued planning attacks against Israeli targets. Cycles of violence persisted, regardless of individual successes or failures. Even as specific tactics evolved, the broader patterns remained unchanged. What happened in Amman mattered to those directly involved and to analysts who studied such events. However, it did not alter trajectories driven by forces larger than any single operation could influence. The physician's white coat, the symbol of healing, became in this case an instrument of death. The oath to do no harm was violated through coercion that exploited vulnerabilities the doctor possessed. Whether history judges him as perpetrator or victim may matter less than what his story reveals about the methods that intelligence services employ and the costs that individuals bear. The weapon was not the poison alone. It was the trust that enabled its delivery, and trust, once weaponized, becomes something that can never be fully restored.